right. Trickle in, trickle in. Find a seat. There's a few seats up in the front. I'm so thrilled and excited tonight to have such a packed auditorium to welcome Emilio Ambasz, who lectures very rarely, and so it's a real privilege, at least in the US, it's a real privilege to have him here tonight. And in the spirit of this school and this semester in particular, to think about expanded forms of practice and of engagement, kind of resonating with the exhibition, The Other Architects, which is in Ross, I think there's no better example than Emilio Ambasz, whose deep beliefs that architecture is about invention and imagination, not only about techne, but also about poesis, carried somehow from his work to himself as one of the most influential yet enigmatic figures of the past 50 years, as he reinvented himself and his practice in multiple ways and excelling every time. First, as a young professor at Princeton University, where he taught, soon after graduating, somehow as a kind of compressed, less than 2 years, sort of a unique experience of getting a master's and a bachelor all at once. Then from 1969, the myth, the legend is, continues. Then from 1969 to 1976, he was a curator of the A&D department at MoMA, where he brought a number of exhibitions together that remain some of the most seminal architecture exhibitions of our time, with great and continued influence to today. First, his groundbreaking 1972 exhibition, Italy, the New Domestic Landscape, still resonates today, as it not only introduced a new generation of radical industrial designers to an American audience, but more importantly, staged a radical rethinking of the relationship between objects and their environments, deeply embedding questions of social and political engagement with aesthetic propositions. In 2009, actually, Ross Gallery shared some of the film produced for environments here at the school. His exhibition, The Taxi Project, reimagined possibilities for public transportation, working with a number of auto manufacturers to invent, in particular, a jitney-type taxi, which would be still revolutionary even by today's standards. Also at MoMA, he launched Universitas, an ambitious research project to rethink the university in the face of the complexities of our increasingly human-made environment. In a 2009 interview recalling the project, which brought together eminent thinkers such as Henri Lefebvre and Hannah Arendt, he said, "We now need a university concerned not only with measuring nature as found, but dealing with the fact that in the process of mastering nature, we are creating a new man-made nature." Weaving together social and environmental engagement with a deep commitment to invention, to imagination, to design, and to aesthetics, rethinking infrastructural urban systems, as well as reimagining how we can, as educational institutions, foster new forms of knowledge and practice in the age of climate change and the Anthropocene. These are all, of course, questions that we ask ourselves today, increasingly, and certainly at this school. Emilio pioneered those questions and already explored and proposed many possibilities for engagement almost 50 years ago, with resonance to today. As an industrial designer, yet another of his many lives, he created a chair that would, if not resist one's movement, then at least really react to them, called the Vertebra, an automatically adjustable office chair that he designed in collaboration with Giancarlo Piretti. The first of its kind, the Vertebra gave rise to an entire industry of ergonomic seating. A sequence of successful products followed, including a toothbrush, a watch, an electric shaver, a telephone, and a pocket-sized folding TV. A favorite was the Flexible pen made by Pentel and designed for school children. And as an architect, his buildings have come to represent a kind of origin for the green movement in architecture. But Emilio's engagement is a very particular form of engagement with the question of quote-unquote green. and one that I have personally found most inspiring. It's not the green of technology or performance, even though evidently his buildings perform quite well. Emilio uses green as a material, as an ingredient amongst his many other ingredients. In his work, neither does the building become landscape, nor does the landscape get absorbed or overwhelmed by and into the architecture. It's not a relationship of formed to formless, or formless to formed, or of object to field. It's not a relationship of difference, but rather of equals, where both building and landscape are strongly figured and formed, at once objects and environments, intertwined together to create an image and an experience at once performative and poetic. Some of his most important buildings include La Casa de Retiro Espiritual, which was part of the 2006 exhibition, the exhibition In Depth at MoMA, the Lucille Hassel Conservatory, the 1992 master plan for the Universal Exposition in Sevilla in Spain, the 1994 Michael and Athletic Cultural Center, and the Fukuoka Prefectural International Hall of the same year. Another favorite of mine is the 2002 Grand Embrace, as well as the 2008 Venice Mestre. And tonight, I hope he will share, I know he has many questions he will share with us, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of the answers which I know will resonate for many years to come. So please join me in welcoming Emilio Ambasz.
Thank you very much for your overly generous introduction. I really only half of that. And thank you very much for coming. I hope I don't disappoint you too much. The Western notion of man's creations as things that stand distinct and separate entities, that stand in contrast with nature, I think has exhausted its intellectual and its ethical capital. We now have, as Dean Andraos was telling us, an emerging man-made garden which is overtaking the one that we were originally given. I believe that we must create an atectonic notion of architecture, where architecture is conceived as an integral component of this man-made nature which is emerging and that we are creating, willingly or unwittingly. I see the primordial task of the architect to be that of reconciling our man-made nature with the organic one that we have been given. There have been some precedents. For example, at the end of the 19th century, Ebenezer Howard, his garden city theories, advanced the ideal of urban redemption by proposing the house in the garden. That's to say, the house surrounded by the garden, perhaps 40% of the land for the house, 60% of the land for the garden. But in this formulation, each component remained separate and distinct. It was a good idea, but it was not sufficient. I think that we must design a pact of reconciliation where we have both the building and the garden, 100% of each one. In such concept, the building gives back, in the form of communally accessible greenery, all the land, or as much as possible, of the land that the building covers. For the last 40 years, I've striven to find a built manner in which to integrate architecture with nature. I have tried in all my projects to return to the community as much of the land the building covers in the forms of gardens which are accessible. And a building of this nature, I believe, should be accessible to all and used by the members of the community at large. The architectural formula, which I use just for purpose of synthesis, of saying the green over the gray, or the soft over the hard, shows one of many possible ways, and this is one alone, to create new urban settlements which do not alienate the citizens from the vegetable kingdom, but rather creates an architecture which I hope is inextricably woven into the greenery, into nature. Buildings like those I'm going to show you demonstrate one possible way in which we can have the green over the gray and give back to the community 100% of the ground that the building covers. And that has to be done in the form of gardens which are accessible from the ground floor up to everyone. And I dare to submit to you that these buildings present evidence that the prevailing notion that the cities are for the buildings and the outskirts are for the gardens and for the parks is mistaken, and it's narrow-minded. These projects demonstrate that it's possible, in one way, to have a building and a garden, as I said before, 100% of each of them. Now, I'm going to use a very different method of lecturing. I'm going to ask myself a number of questions after I show you the work. So be patient, I'll show you some examples because I certainly don't pretend that you know what I've done. And I will give you a little bit of an idea as to the questions I will follow. This is the Casa de Retiro Espiritual. I designed it in 1975, and it got built in the year 2000. I am nothing if not patient. This building looks to you as if it were underground. No, I never built anything below ground because it's very risky for the workers, it's expensive, it makes it impossible to inspect the finishes and to insulate the building properly. I build always above the zero level, and then one day a big machine arrives and we put the earth on the roof and on some of the walls, and we try to model the ground into the landscape. What you're looking at is it's a family house which is used for the weekends. The site is absolutely extraordinary, it's a rolling country site, and there are in this place I'm sorry, I touched the wrong button. No, well, yes, I did, indeed. Help. She's marvelous, she will help. That's all right, thank you. Here we are. I'll try to keep my finger quiet. The unique characteristic of the land are such that I wanted to preserve it, and the only thing that stands as a landmark is really the two walls that you see here. They are in a certain way almost like a mask for architecture. Here in this section, you can see how it operates. Somebody's climbing these staircase. They are not very easy to climb, and they are frightening to descend. I tell you that's the case. And the man walking up is holding himself on the railing, which is really grooved into the wall, and inside that groove runs water that starts its descent from the top. So by the time it comes down, it's very noisy, but as you walk up and up and up, when you get to the very top, you're rewarded with liquid silence. The water then cascades all the way down, turns around in this place, as you see there, the semicircle, and then it's recirculated all the way up. It's an old Arabic device, which you can see in the Alhambra also. Here you can see the roof and covered with greenery. And the house is used, as I said before, by a couple with their two children. They breed horses, so they come here to use the house on the weekend. I designed the furniture. The furniture, as you can see, is structurally made of glass. Fukuoka is the fourth largest building in Japan. This is the model of the project, as I envisioned it at the beginning. It was a competition with 4 architects. The other one was Kisho Kurokawa, who was born in Fukuoka, so he had all the chances to win. And the other 2 architects really belong to construction companies. As you know, architects in Japan mainly work within construction companies. For example, Takenaka Construction Company has 1,000 architects, so you know where to go next. And what I wanted to do is give back to the city half of the park that was being given away by the city in order to raise funds. They were leasing the land of half of the park for about 60 years, I think, was the terms of the lease. And they invited 4 developers, and the developers had to present an architectural project. And in the jury, 46 jurors, 1 alone voted for me. 45 had their head in order, and they voted for Kurokawa. And that invalidated the possibility that the mayor of the city assigned the project to Kurokawa, and then it had to be submitted to the governor of the region. The governor of the region then saw that the Asahi Shimbun, which is a very decent newspaper, if anything like that can be ever said about a newspaper, asked the readers to vote for the building which was most friendly to the city. That was remarkable because in Japan, the press is usually quite apathetic. And the most remarkable thing was that the people voted. And so they voted for this building. And so it went. Here, what I did is I gave them back 100% of the park that they lost. Here, they just can go all the way up. And the reward would be on the very top, the 14th floor, is that they can see the bay of Fukuoka, which is very beautiful. It's almost as beautiful as the bay of Hong Kong. The building, in reality, is made up of office buildings, which were lately taken over by the city. So the government of the city has assumed this building, and the little sketch I did on a yellow piece of paper for the building project is adopted as the logotype. The building also has a theater, an Occidental theater with 2,000 seats, and has a tremendous number of shopping and I don't know how many other things, as well as parking for 500 cars. Etc., etc. It's a very complex building. You can see on the right side, I don't dare to touch this thing. Look on the right side, those are the facade with the inclined mirror. What I do is they would reflect the person standing across the street under a gate, which is the gate to a temple. It's called Tori. And if they saw their image, they would know that all the prayers have been heard. Or so I hoped. This is a building in a new town that Japan Housing Authority wanted to create. Another building done there was done by a very, very good architect. I'll try to remember his name in a second. He's a very good architect indeed, Japanese. But this one was a building for a department store chain. They have about 210 department stores. And they wanted this building so they can bring their employees and teach them manners of Occidental behavior. How do you use a fork? How do you give your hand greeting? But the building has also a number of things into it, like a big sporting facility. Now, this is the maquette, of course, and there's about 100 rooms where the people of the company that come, they stay for 2-3 days. And on the other side, I've done the same thing as I've done in the building in Fukuoka. There are many reasons why I did that. One of them is because in Japan, you have to provide for a building of this sort, and also for the one that you saw in Fukuoka, the one with the stepped sections, you have to provide 4 immense columns of fire exit. Each of the stairways is about 8 feet wide, so they take up an immense amount of the space. As you can imagine, the space is very precious in Japan. So in the case of Fukuoka, as well as in this case, in case of any emergency, the people just can walk out directly onto the inclined plane, in this case, the mound of earth, or the step sections there. So we only had to use 2 stairways. Now, under the grass, there are factories of cookies, there is a shopping, there is a wedding chapel, there is a factory to bottle wine, there is a recording studio, there is a photography lab, there's a tremendous number of things under that. So, and all of them, I assure you, have views directly to the outside. In the model, we can't see them very well, but in reality, they do. Here is in the section, you can see a little bit better what I mean. I hope I don't make a big mess. No, I made a mess. Help again. Sorry. You can fire me. You don't have to pay any. Now, on the left side, better not touch this. On the left side is the sporting facility. It has a half Olympic pool with all other things. And they look onto a winter garden, as well as all the rooms in the so-called hotel. And what this did for the client was that I was able to convince the Japan Housing Authority that a building like this cost more, because if it didn't cost more, developers would do it. And so, since the client was going to spend much more to do this type of building, I asked the Japan Housing Authority to reduce the price of the land, which they did, remarkably. So that was one thing that really made the building possible. Now, I oriented this mound of earth, let's call it like that, towards the west, so people can sit in good weather outside and look at the sunset. The pond that you see in front of you is an artificial pond, which is also used to drain the land. Now, this facade was quite an odyssey. I had to fight with the Ministry of Construction, who demanded that the facade be supported by a rigid structure, space frame. And I told them that if we have a rigid structure, in case of an earthquake, it would crack. There was no way. They demanded that we give them a sample, so we had to build a full-scale piece of the facade and demonstrate to them that in the way that I conceived the structure, which was by having wires outside and wires inside that would take the negative and the positive moments in case of an earthquake, the facade will move like the wings of a plane, and it wouldn't break. The devil wanted it. There was an earthquake a few years after the building was finished. It was nearby, about 16, 18 miles from there, and the building survived it perfectly well, except for one crack in the toilet in the ground, in the basement floor, which I was immensely happy for that, because so the gods would not be offended by the perfection of the building. In this inside garden, you will not believe it, but what you're looking at is there is a road to let a fire truck come in case of fire. You might say, why did I need a fire truck inside to sprinkle water on the facade? You could have had all the sprinklers on the facade. Yes, of course, you're absolutely right, but go and fight with the Ministry of Construction. This is a marvelous foundation that donated this conservatory to the city of San Antonio. The present foundation was the most enlightened man, truly. And, of course, like all those things, their aims were marvelous. Their pocketbooks were pretty small. So I had to find ways of building it and within the constraints of the budget. What you're looking at is, again, bear with me with my finger, there is an entrance, and when you go onto the entrance, you enter into that circle space with a single tree. There's a single tree, and I think that one of the kids that was brought by his father got it right. He says, "Is this the tree of the apples?" So he got the idea that it was the original tree. If you go forward, you enter into a space where the people of the city of San Antonio can bring their flowers and make exhibitions. On the left side, there is an orangerie, which forms part of the colonnade that goes all around. Behind the orangerie, there is a place for alpine parts, so inside there is cold water mist going all the time, and that's probably the reason for its great success. Everybody sits there in the summer. You have a palm building at the end, and my main problem was there was no money for cooling the plants or for heating them, so I had to use the earth to maintain the temperature and use a certain of other devices to make it possible to have the building work just by natural means of ventilation. But it has worked. Now, I had to also find a way in which I could save money by gluing directly the glass onto the structure. In that time, when it was done, which was now about 1980, there was no tradition of gluing glass, so we put in a very thick amount of mastic, so in case the building moves, it wouldn't crack the glass. This is a picture I took the day of the opening. This courtyard was supposed to protect the plants. Why? Because the main problem for this conservatory was that there's certainly plenty of sun in San Antonio, but the winds come from Canada at about 100 and some miles an hour, and they come with they force great temperature drops, and the plants cannot survive it. Sometimes temperature goes down about 20, 25 degrees, and in 2 or 3 hours, so the plants would die. So that's why they have to be protected by glass, and also the glazing is there, so we can have curtains to protect the plants from the sun, from the too much sun. But there are some plants that can survive in a milieu like this courtyard, because they have a certain degree of protection, also they are sturdier, and with the years, the plants grew, and plenty. And this is not abandoned. This is the way that the director of the conservatory wanted it to be. This is an extraordinary undertaking in Venice, Mestre. As you know, Venice is an island and Mestre is the mainland, but they have only one mayor, regrettably, since there are 270 people in Mestre and only 30,000 in Venice. His interests lie with Mestre and not with Venice. But anyway, here there are remarkable people. They have specialized for the last 35 years in eye transplants. And they have airplanes and helicopters, and they are connected with the police, and in case of anybody dying in a car accident and having left a living will, they remove the eyes and they do transplants. But they also are now doing something extraordinary with staminal cells. They are breeding eyes. The roof is a stepped section also, you can walk on that, and the plants on the roof, as well as in other places, are aromatic plants, because the people who come here can't see very well. So I wanted them very much to have a feeling that they were entering into a garden because of the perfume of the plants. As I told you before, the roof is also a means of escape. You can see it in the plant how you would be walking out on either side. A treacherous little thing. I'm going to show it to you directly. Okay, the semicircular garden that you see at the back is where all the classrooms are facing, and it's also a very strong perfumed garden. And there they have classes for doctors in teaching them how to do eye transplants and things of that nature. But again, 100% of the ground has been recovered. Now, you may ask why I did that. I don't know, I don't think, I must tell you, I have images. I'm possessed by images. I remove words when I design things. Because if you use words to design, you exist in a semantic domain. If you're in a semantic domain, the words already mean things which are already understood. But if you create images, sometimes, you're lucky, you create an image which is prototypical and may generate new types of meanings. I did that, and somebody told me that in reality, Emilio, you did that because this is a reference to the Michelangelo painting in the Sistine Chapel where God is trying to give the spirit to Adam. Exegesis is so elastical. What you see there in the back is a hospital. It's a very large hospital, 660 beds. And the feature of this hospital is that when you walk in, you don't get the feeling that you get when you walk in a hospital, in Italy at least, that you're walking into a military garrison. You are received by plants and flowers. The name of the hospital is the Guardians Angels Hospital. And inside, we grow flowers. Now, the facade is about 600 feet, if not 700 long, and about 100 feet high. And what you have inside is really a greenhouse. Half of the rooms of the patients look down onto the greenhouse. The other half, that is not so lucky, has their own garden in front, as you can see on the right side of the section. This is, again, the day of the inauguration. Since then, the plants have grown much more. I have a witness sitting here, Professor Bertel, who was there, so in case you don't believe me. But they really have grown much more than the day of the inauguration. This is a project in Puglia. Puglia is at the bottom of the Italian boot. And here, someone inherited from his father 4 hectares of land, about approximately 10 acres, but he couldn't build anything because this land is under the protection of the forestry division, and they are very jealous of, don't allow anything to be built. But I demonstrated to them that we wouldn't take away anything in terms of greenery, and that if they allow the client to build these things, he would be able to pay them to maintain the forestry, because the forest is about 1.5, 1.8 miles all the way to the sea. And like always, there is not enough money for maintaining forests. The client presented this project to the European Commission, and he got himself nothing less than €500 million, which he didn't have to repay, as a grant for a demonstration project of this nature. What you're looking at, in this case, are the residential part of the project. You may see some little squares, as if this was Gruyere cheese with square holes. That is really, imagine the tradition in Puglia is that people sit in their patios. In the morning, they have their breakfast there because it's still cool from the night, and at night it cools again, so they sit in the patio, have their dinner. What you're looking at is really a loggia. Imagine that I remove one wall from the facade and I leave open the room, and all the rooms don't look to the outside because then they would be collecting too much heat. They look to the loggia inside, and that way brings them back to the tradition of domestic housing in Puglia. Of course, it's all covered in greenery, so at least the roof people, the people who have the last floor, don't suffer so much, as is the case usually with people who have the roof apartment. This is a hotel. This is a hotel situation with naturally a number of social auditoriums and stories of that nature. In order to protect the plants that grow there, and I couldn't have glass there because the plants would fry if they are behind glass. Those are which looks like kind of a green mist. It's really a mesh. It's a green mesh which retains about 40% of the winds that may be coming and allows the air to come in and the plants to survive. And this is another of the hotels and during the process of construction. This is not yet finished. This is a museum that a gentleman in Taiwan, who is a serious collector of very avant-garde Taiwanese and Chinese art, has wanted me to build for him. And the collection is really very good. I designed this building for him, where again, 100% of the ground has been recovered. And what you see on top of the roof, that's a kind of a courtyard for open-air sculptures, so he wouldn't have to have more than one guardian to take care of that. The main entrance is, as you can see, you can guess it's in that way. And there is also a secondary entrance, which is the night entrance. So that takes you to the auditorium and to the seminar rooms and to the dining rooms and restaurants and everything like that. So people don't have to enter the museum at night. So we can remove that type of problem, which many museums have whenever they have to have people passing through the museum installations to get to some of their events. Now, what you look at is aluminum, which has been anodized as gold. I was told that Chinese like gold. Certainly, they must be the only ones in the human condition. Now, the building had to be designed symmetrically, because there are many earthquakes here. So if one of the sides of the building was heavier than the other one, it would then gain momentum and pull the building away. So that's why there's very strong symmetry of the building. This is the secondary entrance. In this section, you can see the immense entrance lobby. The immense entrance lobby was designed so that the owner of the museum, or the patron of the museum, could receive the president of Taiwan in a great event. It was really his moment of glory. And his name, curiously, is Glory. Now, you see those two little triangular pieces like that. I did them because I didn't know how to finish these irregular parallelograms. But I was told that that's in the great Chinese tradition of having those kind of pointed things that catch the bad spirits that try to come down into the building. You can see it in the temples, you can see it in things like that. Eni is a building of the petrochemical cartel of Italy, and they have built a curtain wall building outside of Rome, in Eul, which is a district developed by Mussolini, and by now is, of course, part of Rome. In 1960-something, they did this building, and they didn't know really too much how to do curtain wall building, so water is coming through the facade, rain, wind, etc., etc. So Eni wanted to change the facade. They invited 4 architects. One of them was Jean Nouvel, and the other one was a Belgian architect, the name was Siemens, or some pronunciation, something like that. The 4th one, God forgive me, I can't remember his name. And they all 3 of them proposed new facades. What I thought is that if I make a new facade, I have to remove the people from the building for 2 years, and that would create tremendous disruption in the process of working. And since you would anyway need scaffolding to build a new facade, I suggested to the Eni people that instead of making a scaffolding which is 3 feet or 4 feet wide, we make scaffolding which is 8 feet wide. And in the middle of it, we put one single pane of glass, vertical pane of glass, which would stop the wind, would stop the rain, would stop the noise. And we don't have to remove anybody from the building, and we can have the technicians who have to wash the windows walking in between the old and the new glazing. And outside of the new glazing, we can have plants because the climate in Rome is quite benign. You can see it in that way. This is a very old project, it must have been probably 1974. This was a group of people who really created a company to do computer programming for the industry in Mexico. And what I did for them is I proposed we make two walls to define the space. One of them is like a billboard in Times Square, and the other one is a sun-collecting device, which we all knew perfectly well was inefficient and very expensive, but we did it more like anything else, like a propaganda for how advanced this group was. I had a problem, of course, that if you remember, Hernán Cortés, when he came to Mexico City, he found a city that had an urban system which was almost, if not more, sophisticated than Venice. So he covered it all up, but the water is still there. So what I propose to do is that we drain the water by creating this immense pool, which is about 500 feet by 400 feet, and we have all the offices as floating barges, and the barges can be moved around, as you can see, pulled by that little boat, and according to whatever projects they had at hand. And that cylinder on the right side is where all the hot water is turned into electricity. It's an old device. I mean, nowadays it's not done in that way. But anyway, under that white platform sits the administrative offices and also the immense IBM computers that they had there at the time. And of course, I needed to make sure that I could, number one, recirculate the water of the basin because it would stagnate otherwise, and I could cool the area. So I borrowed from people who have made it for the Pepsi Cola Pavilion in an expo in Japan, the technique they invented to create cold water mist. The particles of water are so tiny that the clothing cannot absorb it. If a lady with hairspray, I don't know if they still use it, would walk through there, she would not have any problem. It only refreshes. Even if you get it in your hand, you would not get wet. You would just have a feeling of freshness. Anyway, but the key point is that that cloud, when the sun hits it, gets a rainbow. And all that complex, in some way, again, without thinking what I was doing, I was perhaps referring to the old temples, or the Mayan temples, because the gods dwelt inside the temples. And in this case, these were going to be the new gods of the technological society emerging. Now, this is one arrangement of the office barges. This is another possible one. But I told them that, frankly, all people could work at home. They didn't have to come here. And we could just take one of the barges and turn it into an island of flowers, as in Xochimilco. They looked at me and they didn't say anything, but I knew that they were saying, loquito. Okay. As you well know, World Expos always leave white elephants. There is an immense amount of money to build them. It seldom serves for anything else except the expo, even then. So I thought that for 1992, to celebrate the 500th anniversary of the discovery of America, Spain would send their Minister of Foreign Relations to visit all the countries of the Americas and tell them, look, 500 years ago, we sent 3 boats that gave the new world, a new world to the old one. We would like you now to send us a boat telling us what you achieved in the last 500 years and telling us what you dream for the future. And those would be floating barges. So at the end of the expo, they could be removed easily. Also, there would be no problems, and we wouldn't need any monorails or anything of the sort. Sorry, there is always 10% if you buy a monorail. But anyway, you could come with the ferries directly from any point along the Guadalquivir, which is a river of. And with the earth removed to create all those ponds, I created 3 little mountains. I did it because I thought that the civilian children are taught in school a poem where they talk about the mountains of Seville. There are no mountains in Seville. So I didn't want them to think their parents are liars. So I made this thing. And the stadium that you see is a half stadium because it can only be used after 7, 8 p.m. when there is no more sun. And what you see, this kind of regular pattern of greenery, is really a very elevated grid that maintains planting on top so that it casts shade over the space, because you can get perfectly well 100 and some degrees in the summer in Seville. Here in the section below, you can see that kind of umbrella, green umbrella, which is high above the installations of the exhibition. And you can see on the right side one proposal for how the barges could float. But my main notion was to try to design for Seville what Seville needed in 1993 and do it in 1992 and use the Expo to develop. And there I took an idea from Daniel Burnham. He, in 1892, created the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America in Chicago. But he designed in such a way that it was the pattern for the development of Chicago in that direction. So that was the only other expo that really succeeded in being of some use to the city. This is the present condition of the port of Monte Carlo, or Monaco. Naturally, Monaco derives a considerable amount of income from yachts being moored there. It's very considerable. And they need land. They need land to build apartment buildings. If you consider an apartment here cost about 12,000 euros, no, forgive me, $12,000 a square foot, you can have an idea why they took away the only little plaza the Principality had to build more buildings. Now, they were planning to have an artificial peninsula in a location which was about 80 meters deep, about 250, 260 feet deep along the shore, but it's already that deep there. What I proposed to them is that we could do it in the port, because in the port the depth is only 18 meters, and all the trucks bringing materials wouldn't have to bother the circulation, which is already pretty clogged, but they could all of them come by boat. And I proposed to them that we take the old arch, it worked. You see the 2 points where the arch comes here, keep the 10 points and reverse the arch. So we maintain the same amount of linear inches of moorage, which is quite important to the Principality. But doing it in this way, we get 10 hectares of land, that's about 25 acres of land. Half of that for a park, half of that for hotels and residences. And the other thing that would solve this problem is the famous problem of the Formula One races, which has a very weak and very risky place called La Rascasse, where the cars have to take a very strong turn, and usually there are accidents there. So we could solve it completely by letting the cars just run in the direction of this kind of zigzag, which lands. Now, the cost of that would have been 300 million, and I came in with a bank that would finance it and would pay an annual royalty to the Principality. But the old Prince Rainier died, regrettably, and his son, who is the most charming fellow, truly, is not so used to dealing with the forces of the city. So he told me that he didn't have the strength to do it. So the artificial peninsula is marching at the tune of 2 billion euros, and probably will be 4 billion, and it will take twice the amount of time that I have in mind doing it. This is another case of my projects where I lost the project because it was too cheap. The dam that you see there is a dam which doesn't have to be cement. It could perfectly well be earth cement, because it's so wide and the base is so widespread that in reality there is no need for that. The city of Salamanca asked me if I would create a park or a plaza in the great Plaza Mayor. Plaza Mayor was the place where they used to have bullfights, but it's really the living room of the city. And as you can see, people sit outside, but also under the portico which surrounds the four sides of this, they can also sit there. And I told the city people that if I'm going to put trees there, nobody's going to be able to see the marvelous Baroque facade that Churriguera and his nephew did. And therefore, I proposed to them that there was a better solution. The solution is to create a series of stepped sections which would have holes, and through the holes, trees would grow. And we would select trees with very small leaves, but trees that in the spring and in the winter and in summer would cast shade, because there also temperature is important. And in the winter, the leaves would fall down, and because they're so small, there would be no problem in eliminating them. And in the winter, of course, the sun would warm up that step section, graderie or stadium shape, and we would maintain the heat in this kind, which was like a passive battery of heat. The project was much appreciated. but I was told that it was too sweet for the Castilian spirit. Yes, I am adding chapters to the big Spanish book called OL, Opportunities Lost. This is a building in the Catskills. Here the client bought himself 3,000 acres of land where you couldn't build even the doghouse. And he came to me saying, "You're going to make it possible for me to do it." I said, "Why don't you buy 30 acres of decent, of legal land instead of buying 3,000 acres of non-possible land?" He says, "Oh, you're going to change it." All right, so I made a project, and naturally, 7 environmental groups arrived to my office with access, more or less, and something even more powerful. They brought with them Robert Kennedy Jr., who is an environmental lawyer. But when they saw the project, they said that they had expected shoe boxes with square windows, and that since they were very concerned when they do trekking up, looking down, they would like to see green, and this provided the greenery, and we didn't take away any of the green from the place. They accepted it. So he finally got now the permission to go ahead. There are about 150 rooms in this hotel, and there is also, there's going to be what do you call it, a wellness center with a spa, I think it's called like that. Green, yes, but non troppo, okay? In this case, green here would fry on the facade, okay? So the greenery is inside. And they are all in kind of atriums on the north side of the buildings. There are 2 buildings here, triangular in plan. And it is an office building really only for lawyers, because the Supreme Court is across the street. There are a number of independent entrances, so every lawyer firm would have their own independent entrance with their own independent receptionist, mezzanine, and reception floor. And when they go up to their 4 floors that they were supposed to rent in order to get their own independent entrance, they would arrive to double height space, and then they can walk into that atrium that each of them would have, which is about 4 stories high, with plants, because the plants would be there. By creating this diagonal, I create shade. Obviously, it's all year long. And the building, of course, has 2 sides where there are windows which are shaded by the brise soleil, but the hypotenuse of the triangle is where you have all the blind elements of a building, like stairways and bathrooms and things of that sort. This is the last project that I'm showing you. This is one thing going on. It's a museum to be built, hopefully, in Madrid. And it sits on the Paseo del Prado. The Paseo del Prado is the ground boulevard where are most of the museums. Across the street is the Museo del Prado, and across the street is the Botanical Garden. A few yards away is the Reina Sofia Museum of Contemporary Art. The Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum is also on the same avenue. So this will become the Paseo dell'Arte. I don't need natural light inside the museum. I really abhor it because ultraviolet would ruin drawings and would ruin plastic models and anything of that sort. So the 2 walls, which are defining the entrance in the corner, are covered with greenery. In this case, simple ivy, which is what we were advised by the director of Botanical Garden across the street, would not bring any new sickness to his plants in the Botanical Garden. This is the entrance for services, and it also has glazing so people who come to this point can look outside. And I wanted very much the people to be able to orient themselves, so there are 3 places on each floor where they can look outside. This would be looking on the direction where the entrance was. So they don't lose sense, which is one of the things that bothers me greatly when I go to a museum. I usually I disorient myself. Now, you're supposed to be making questions, but I'm supposed not to let you. I'm supposed by myself not to let you. I've heard them all, so allow me to now ask questions that I would like to have heard. There are 2 ways to cast shade or shadow. You can be a tree, You can be a cloud. I've always wanted to be a radical cloud, that is to say, a cloud with roots. Yes, I do love trees. In the Western world, a tree is there because somebody planted it or somebody left it there. We have an emerging man-made garden, which is overtaking the one we were given. We now need, I believe very strongly, to elaborate a new philosophical definition of nature that encompasses architecture as one of its inseparable components. Only in that way can we establish a pact of reconciliation of architecture with a constantly transforming nature. Well, I hope I don't break your heart, but if nature were to have welcomed us in the guise we have become, we would have no need to make shelters. I believe that in our pursuit to master nature as found, we have created that second man nature I've been harping about. And that is intricately related to the given nature. And as I said before, we need to redefine architecture as one aspect of the man-made nature, but to do so, we need first to have a philosophic, contemporary redefinition of nature. And for that, perhaps we need a new philosophic type of academy. We might want to call it perhaps the universitas, which means the totality. If an architectural work does not move the heart, what's the point of it? It's just one more building. I'm not ashamed to say that I try, not always succeed, in pursuing the transcendental in my work. It is an ungraspable pursuit, it is an elusive pursuit, but at least I'm devotedly dedicated to trying once in a while to achieve it. I've always believed that architecture is an act of the myth-making imagination. I believe that the real task of the architect begins once functional and behavioral needs have been satisfied. It's not hunger, but it is love, it is fear, and sometimes wonder, which makes us create. The architect, cultural and social context changes constantly, but his task, I believe very strongly, remains always the same, to give poetic form to the pragmatic. There is in all of us a need, a very deep need for rituals, for ceremony, for processions, for magical garments, for magical gestures. It is an archetypal quest in which we all partake. People tell me that some of the build that they sense I am somehow engaging in mysticism. On one hand, I'm playing with the pragmatic elements of my time, such as technology. On the other hand, I'm proposing a certain mode of existence which proposes a certain alternative mode. My work is a search for giving architectural things for primal things. I not always succeed, but by primal things I mean being born, being in love, and dying. I think that what I mean is we exist on an emotional, passionate, and essential level. And I agree. I use very austere elements to express this quest, and therefore the gesture may be seen as very austere also. By doing it in this way, I believe that they may be far more durable. It's certainly far more classical attempt. I'm interested in the passionate and in the emotional when they assume a timeless guise. The ideal gesture would be not to need architects, but arrive to a plot of land so immensely fertile and so welcoming that slowly the land would assume a shape, providing us with an abode. And remember that abode comes from to abide. That means to wait inside. You know what to wait for. And within this abode, being such a magical space, it would never rain, there would not be any hardships of any sort. Regrettably, we must build our houses on earth only because we are not welcome on the land. Every act of construction is a defiance of nature. In a perfect nature, we would need to make no houses. Now I'm going to tell you kind of an infantile secret. When I was 14, I attended a lecture given by the cultural attaché of the Japanese embassy in Buenos Aires, who was a poet, by the way, and a painter, and a rather very good painter. And what I learned from him is a word in Japanese called yugen. In the way I understood it, being 14 years old, is that Jugend means that if you find the quintessence of a problem, you will have a better access to an irreducible solution. And the thread supporting my design quest in every area, whether products or architecture, is a single preoccupation, finding the root of a problem, its essence. Now, for expressive means, I try to approach the problem in an austere and, may I say, graceful manner. I long for an architecture which has been reduced to essentials and which at the same time is an architecture full of diverse meanings. For me, such concision is a method to achieve a multidimensional epigrammatic architecture. If you allow me to paraphrase Paul Valéry, the French poet, my quest is for the essential in architecture. It's not about being simple or light like a feather, it's about being concise and essential like a bird. Now, architecture is for me one of the many aspects of our quest for cosmological models. And the quest for that which is infinite and eternal and ever-present, I suspect, maybe it's contained in very few lines, which manifest themselves with great economy of expression. In a such seemingly simple manner, those lines may hopefully acquire the fascinating power of mythical structures. Maybe it is because I seek for that I love Lucretius, the Roman poet, his Rerum Natura, so much. Now, I really like architects. They have always bled for the ills of the world, in my view. But they will stand far behind in the line of those sent to hell for their environmental sins. But they will go there, inevitably, if they do not honor their ethical responsibility to propose alternative models for the future. Something that Ernst Bloch, the German philosopher, called das Prinzip Hoffnung, which means the principle of hope, which means that you have to propose alternative models of the future, not to perpetuate the present. I think that the project of Fukuoka, which you have seen, demonstrates that you can have both the green and the gray inside a high-density situation, and that the notion that the cities for the buildings and the peripheries for the parks is a mistaken and unhealthy idea. You can have them both. But I would like to know where people got their strange idea that pastoral fields existed only outside the city walls. Take, for example, Bologna, medieval city. You could go up to one of the towers of the city and discover that behind the facade of streets without trees, there are immense gardens that occupy almost 35% of the land of the city. Those were once vegetable gardens and places where cows and goats grazed. Those grounds were of utmost importance to survive a siege. I strive, I hope for an urban future where you can open your door and walk out directly on a garden, regardless how high your apartment may be. Maybe Fukuoka is one example, but I insist it's only one of many such possible things that other architects may develop and reconcile our need for building with our requirement for greenery. I am completely opposed to the notion of moratorium. The notion of not building anything in order not to create problems is, to me, an immoral position. We have to find ways of building, but in such a way that we do not generate conflicts with nature. Well, Gaia, to me, is not a theory. It's a poetical hypothesis, and I'm all for poetry. It is a metaphor, but it provides a temporary structure on which we can, while we are disoriented, affix many seemingly unrelated questions. It provides a frame of reference. Gaia may help us to connect for a while, just for a while, seemingly disparate points into a temporarily cohesive theoretical structure, after which we have to throw it away. It will branch out, forgive me the pun. The so-called green movement is a big umbrella, where at present I would not dare to cast too much light, because the shadows are still looking for their bodies. It is a state of awareness. It does not yet constitute a conceptual reality, because it lacks a precise system of discourse and a theoretical structure that will allow it to be transmitted as a body of knowledge and it would allow it to be constantly re-evaluated. So far, it is an attitude. It's not yet a principle. Well, I can make it very simple. My existential wager is on poetry and on a commitment to justice, which for me is one of the necessary but not sufficient conditions to achieve such a high plateau. Justice, whether social or moral, is a conceit of the mind. Justice does not exist in nature. But despite this cruel fact, I feel very strongly that it is our ethical imperative to pursue its implementation on earth, even if we know that it is a very delicate structure, that it is held together by such ethereal material as abnegation and altruism, but it is destined to collapse at night. Every new morning, we must rebuild it. Oh, well, this is too long. I don't want to bore you. And this is too personal. Well, for me, the definition of courage is not that of someone who marches into battle unconcerned, but that of someone who marches into battle trembling. But nevertheless, he marches ahead because that's what he must do. The lucidity of fear, if it does not paralyze, is a badge of honor. I've always known that my pursuit of my models, or alternative models, would be rejected, mocked, or at best I would be left alone to bark at the moon. 40 years of barking has given me a very nice voice. Oh, well, no, this is kind of having complaining. Oh, I'm very interested in technology. As a matter of fact, I'm one who designs my work in one-to-one scale, but I really also know how to manufacture those details. Obviously, this is a result of my being also an industrial designer, and I design, I engineer, I make the tooling, and I solve all problems of production for the products that I have invented. I believe that that's the only way to actually solve the problems that technology may impose upon a technological society is by using technology. The problem with a technological society is that most of the people are technically illiterate, and therefore they are under the spell of techniques and under the rule of high priests, and may I add, under the risk of demagogues. But one should not confuse the use of technical pyrotechnics with architecture. It's a very different thing. And allow me again to restate. If an architectural work does not move the heart, what's the point? It's just one more building. To make a green building, you need technology, no question. But to create architecture, you need art, and that is a capital question. I'm only interested in discovery. I'm not interested in recovery. I'm very keen on invention. I'm not interested in classification. In the yet uncharted realm of invention, taxonomy is a process that has not yet arrived. Taxonomy being the science of classification. In the same way, as I search for essentials and lasting principles in architecture, by opting to write fables rather than writing theoretical essays, maybe I grasp something basic. Fables usually remain immutable long after theories have crumbled. The invention of fables is central to my work and method, and it is not just a literary accessory, because the subtext of a fable is, after all, a ritual, and it is the support of rituals that most of my work addresses itself. If you allow me, I will read you a very short fable. This was done by James Wines, who is sitting in that corner. Thank you to James and his wife who did it. The little village was in the grip of fear. The fable is called Fabula Rasa. The little village was in grip of fear, fear of the gods, or divine rages, fear of human passions. But one of the men started to build a construction in the center of the village, circular in plan, cylindrical in shape, and with a dome-like roof. He used stones, wood, and mud. When he finished his travails, he walked outside and he told his neighbors that what he had erected was in the shape of the universe, and that inside this temple, the gods of the universe dwelt. Then, using a branch that he took out from the inside of the temple, he marked a circle all around the village, and with the help of the villagers, he built a wall of earth and stones to defend themselves. In the center of the village, next to the temple, he erected a large hut, which he then covered completely with earth, except for the entrance naturally, with a mound of earth. Now, on top of this mound, he placed 6 slabs of stone. He called this his house, but the villagers knew better. They called it the palace. When he died, his body was laid down inside a hut that he had called his house, together with all his belongings. And his son covered the entrance with the large stone slabs that he removed from the top of the mound. Some people say that this is the way how architecture started. Thank you very much. Shoot.
No. How many questions did you ask yourselves? 12, 15?
For your sake, only 13. But in reality, they are close to 45.
45.
But you wisely didn't give me enough time. That was very wise.
Well, I had many notes, but I can't compete with the questions that you asked. So I wanted really mostly to actually thank you for this wonderful
I'm the one obliged to you
lecture.
And to the patient audience.
Especially today, we have students who are here thinking about whether they should become architects, and I couldn't have hoped for a more passionate plea for what architects can do, the way they can think, for what architecture can be today. And I think you've given it in your work and in your words a dimension that we sometimes forget in the daily grind of our métier. And but then when you hear the words and see the images and these incredible models and these this sort of incompleteness, your architecture, your buildings are always open, the corners are inviting, there's this incredible intertwining and the kind of coming together of the most sort of meaningful ideas, let's say, with a real mastery of scale. So I just wanted mainly really to thank you for all of this. It's kind of really very unique, and so
I'm the one obliged to you for your compliments. I don't hear them very often.
Well, as you said, I think there is something else. Maybe it's this 40 years and the consistency of the search. I'm, fascinated.
I'm a boy with an idea fix.
Yeah, but the idée fixe took on so many different forms, and I think again, like thinking about people starting and thinking about kind of keeping things together as you're, looking at the scale of a glass or a pen or an exhibition, and these ideas seem to have built across all these scales, across all these modes of engaging. And it was fascinating that you now really showed buildings. Does it take this long to maybe fall in love with buildings? Because it's not so easy at times to love buildings.
Well, it takes so long that I had to dedicate myself to industrial design.
Right.
So I could, in some way, maintain the office. At the beginning, certainly, there was not a line of people in front of my office.
Yeah.
But my main view of what I do is I don't do architecture, I don't do industrial design. I try to invent. So if you ask me what do I want on my tombstone, it would be inventor. But I've been changing that lately. I've been thinking another things, like if they only let live.
But you've also, you're an inventor, but a very special kind of inventor. You've called yourself also a problem solver, and I like, the way you start every project. You kind of take givens, the pragmatics, and then you sort of turn them completely over their heads to turn them into, as you said, a kind of poetic proposition. But it really starts from the kind of given.
Well, I shouldn't say it in front of students. That's not true the way
Please,
I work.
like.
I shouldn't say it in front of students. I don't work in that way. I am extremely afraid of using words when I design. I try to clean myself of words and to enter into a pre-design, a pre-semantic state. Because if you use words for design, the words, of course, belong to language, and language is already a convention. You want to invent something, you cannot be using elements from a convention. So what I let myself do is I let images come to me. I do not know what they mean, but I let them come. I call them, if they're worthy of that name, prototypes. And in a prototype, many times architects and painters and people don't know what the prototype means when it emerges, when it comes out. It has to be interpreted. And many times it can be even wrongly interpreted. But whatever is the substance of idea that such image possesses, it's already in the image. Even your mistakes of interpretation would not change the content of the image. This is something that Charles Sanders Peirce, your pragmatic philosopher, has made quite clear. Once the prototype arrives, and somehow it gets understood, and somehow it starts permeating the culture, and it gets to be adopted, the prototype becomes a type. So you enter the domain of typology. But with time, such type gets so absorbed by the culture and they become so commonplace that they become stereotypes. And all my work is dedicated to the invention of prototypes. And my attitude is I believe that they can only be arrived by letting images come to me. Now, you cannot build a school on the basis of that. That's not possible to be transmitted. You can only tell how you do it, and hope they're not going to come and spit on your tombstone.
But let's talk about images, though, because the kind of image that you're talking about is very different from. I mean, actually, I think maybe we should, as a school, engage with this question of image, as our students, are constantly surrounded with a flow of images. But this is a very different image that you're talking about, so I wanted to elaborate.
Well, when I mentioned before the notion of a universitas or an academy, we have had the philosophical academies with the Greeks. We have had the scientific universities, starting with von Humboldt. We have, through those scientific universities, developed methods to master nature. But in order to invent, that means making a lonely jump over a void. And that requires the development of a different system of thought, and requires that the culture reward such attempts. And that's why I was very interested in postulating, in another life, the notion of a universitas concerned with the problem of the design and the management of the man-made environment, and by developing a system of thought which operates in the domain of synthesis and not in the domain of deduction. Doesn't mean that you don't deduce, doesn't mean that you throw away all the body of experience that we have accumulated. That has to be taken into account. It's really like that old saying, I think that Gropius quoted it once, saying, you develop an ineffable technique and that you let yourself at the mercy of intuition.
I think intuition is maybe one of the aspects we don't, would be one step that we could foster more radically in schools.
Well,
I
it's
work-
not possible really to have a school on the basis of intuition. Allow me
trying to
tell you that,
radicalize our
okay?
project here.
It is a very difficult situation. Okay, I think that you have to systematize the intuitions that others have had and be able to transmit it so that they develop that body of ineffable techniques that I was talking before, and then they can let themselves to the mercy of intuition, but not within an academic institution. I believe that by the nature of such an institution, it would inhibit it.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that the way you approach your work today is different than the way you approached it 10, 20, 30 years ago?
No, really, I only get larger projects now.
That's what's amazing, I think. The
No,
consistency.
I have the same attitude. I haven't changed it. I told you, I'm idea fix.
I think we should open it up. Yeah, is that okay? A few questions?
You want to risk it? Okay.
Yeah, wait, this is where we take risk, yes.
Courage.
Thank you for this amazing...
Wait.
Hi, thank you for this really amazing lecture. What really stood out for me was the way that there's always a body of water, or you always use water in your projects. And for someone who lives in New York City, and for someone who lives in New York City in 2016, where we're always trying to push away the water, my question is, like, what role does it have in your projects, and if it has evolved around the year, like, or through the years, like, does it have a certain role in, like, the landscapes and the gardens that you're always creating?
Well, sometimes I think I use water to wash away my guilt, but you cannot have a garden without water, and water is one of the elements of nature, and I think that it is an essential element to be present in any building for many practical reasons even, You have a reservoir of water, you don't have to create a tank on top of the building with 40,000 liters or 10,000 gallons or whatever it is, as is the case with the museum I showed you. The firemen in Madrid have asked me to put up close to 100,000 liters, that's about 25,000, no, forgive me, much more than that, gallons of water. It's an immense weight on the building because they cannot imagine that ivy will not burn. So I had to do it. But water is an element that, if you have it at hand, is always immensely helpful. It always creates a certain amount of noise, a certain amount of things that help to kind of pacify people if it is used in a certain form, like a cascade of water. As you saw the project with the step section, it was supposed to have such a cascade also. I'm sorry, that's the only answer I can do. There are elements I use constantly. I repeat myself.
Do you have a prototypical image of the garden?
I'm sorry, forgive me.
Do you have a prototypical image of the garden?
Do I have
A prototypical image of the garden.
Well, last time I was thrown out of one. I kept it with me and I'm always trying to find it again. No, I don't have a prototypical image. The only thing I like are informal gardens. I have a resistance to French-Italian gardens because they're very formal. And anything which is formal is to me artificial. I prefer, honestly, the gardens in the English manner that resemble somehow natural garden. But of course, it's all artificial. There's no question about that. It's done with art and office, and officio. Yes.
Have you ever designed a building in a drier environment? I mean, does the...
Well, you've seen this very immense
the
building.
The immense building, yeah.
There, you cannot have plants outside because they wouldn't survive. No, but they are inside.
Yeah.
They are inside. Wait, so they give you the... Else I can't hear.
Oh, sure.
Have you done like projects with like farms or like animals or like agriculture or
Yes,
maybe gardens?
I have. Yes, many years ago. I didn't show it because I have so many projects and I had to somehow limit the number. Yes, I did a project like that for a community of Chicanos who lived in California, and they had animals, and I had to create for them that space. It's published in one of my books, so yeah, believe me, I did it. Courage, I'll cover my eyes, I won't know who said it.
Here, this one here.
Throughout your work, I think there's a certain formal language, like certain forms that repeat themselves. And in repeating those forms, do you think that you've developed inadvertently maybe a formal language and somehow kind of categorized those kind of essential forms into something more like formal, I guess?
May I quote an answer I got to something similar as a question that was put to Jorge Luis Borges when he came once to give a lecture in Princeton. He says that he's a man of very few ideas that he keeps constantly repeating. I take your point.
Actually, I think Rem Koolhaas once said to become successful, just keep repeating yourself. So
Well, I think that he also heard Philip Johnson saying that to be a successful architect, you need 10% of talent, 90% of character, and certainly Philip had 95% of character.
Hi, thank you for your speech. I really appreciated your comment about that you consider courage to be not marching into battle with no fear, but to be marching into battle trembling. And I was wondering if maybe you had an anecdote about a time in your career where you felt that you had to march into battle trembling, or perhaps had a situation of resistance or difficulty that you had to work through.
Compromise. The only compromise in all my career is, if you remember the last project I showed you, the museum in Madrid, that has the roof sticking out. The city of Madrid, in reality, the councilman for urbanism, who hates my architecture deeply and confessedly, said that I was invading territory that does not belong to me, but to the city, the sidewalk. And I had to round it off. But it was a tactical retreat, because I'm expecting that he will throw me out of office in the next elections, and I will do it. And that is the only compromise. In order not to do compromises, I did industrial design, okay? So I didn't have to accept things because the income was coming from the industrial design inventions. And I have 280 mechanical patents, and that's what supports until clients started making mistakes and coming to me.
Note to self, start an industrial design company. Or maybe we can start a school.
I'm sorry?
We can start a school here. Are you ready for another life?
No, may I give you another answer?
Sure.
The Emperor of China received a very beautiful gift from his prime minister. That was a set of screens, what the Japanese call byobo. Yeah? And 6 screens like that. And they were so beautiful that the emperor told his prime minister, "Thank you for the gift, but I would like you to order 200 such screens for my concubines." So the prime minister went to see the artist and came back with a very long face. And the emperor asked him, "What is the matter?" He says, "Well, sire, the painter. Well, the painter says that he wants 1 for the first screen, 2 for the second one, 4 for the third one, 8 pieces of gold for the fourth one, 16 for the fifth one, and there is not enough money in the whole empire to pay for that. But how dare he? He's just copying it. Bring him to the palace." So the painter came to the palace, and the emperor was pretty enraged and said, "How dare you? You're just copying. You're repeating yourself." And he said, Sire, repeating oneself rusts the spirit. I've done the professor, I will not do it again.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you define as invention or to invent. Like, what does that?
I'm sorry.
I was wondering if you could, like, describe what that actually means to you to invent something.
I'm frightened you're asking that. Invention means creating something which does not yet exist.
But don't you reference things that already exist out there?
I'm
Like,
sorry?
is there anything?
Do you reference things that already exist?
Always, we keep on building on what was before. There's absolutely no full-fledged, unique, non-referential type of invention. Every invention builds itself on whatever has been created before, whether the methods of production or materials or whatever it is. It is just that somehow certain things that existed before were recombined in a different form, and perhaps something else has been added.
One more?
No, no, it's perfectly okay.
Yeah,
I'm just
you want it? Okay.
Sorry. Thank you very much for the talk. You said that you agreed that you're a man of a few ideas, and there's certainly a few very strong ideas that go through all the work that you showed us. Where would you say those ideas come from? There's obviously a time or a place where you got those ideas. So have you been able to trace that?
I think that was his
I've been
first
thrown
question.
out by a psychiatrist. No, I don't know from where they come from. Sorry to give you a very uneducated and non-university answer. I don't know from where they come. When somebody comes to me with a problem, perhaps I absorb the problem. I never draw anything. I keep it in my head. And I walk around with that in my head. So if I'm waiting for the elevator or the subway, I work on that in my head. And once I get that so-called image, which usually arrives in the form of a section, I draw it up in an A4 piece of paper, and then we enlarge it because I draw it up in scale. I never ever think in terms of plan. I always think in terms of section, because that's the way we phenomenologically experience architecture, is in section, not in plan, unless you're an angel, and I have no pretensions to that yet.
Hello. Hi. So it's a question from environmental ethics that I think is important for the architect to answer, and of all those, I think you're a great person to answer it. But do you think there is design in nature?
Yes, indeed. But how does it come about? How is it possible? It is one of the greatest mysteries in the world. I truly don't know how it happens. I can tell you a fable, but it's a very cruel fable. When he created the world, he observed that his creatures were slowly deteriorating and becoming dust. So, to correct the situation, he decided he would convince the elephant that he wants to be a dancer, the serpent that she wants to be a flyer, and man that he wants to be an angel. Well, the creatures lived longer, but they still collapsed. So he told them, eat each other. And then he retired unto himself to ruminate about his imperfection. End.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.